With the Ryzen 5 5600, I ran out of 6-core CPUs to test, and even though I was hunting for another 6-core chips for the very first generation of Ryzen, for this video we'll test the Ryzen 5 1500X. This means that we're going to test a quad-core CPU. Granted, it does have hyperthreading, well, SMT for the more pedantic, so the task manager will show 8 logical cores. The processor will boost up to 3.7 GHz and it has 16 MB of L3 cache, an amount that is the norm for the Zen and Zen Plus CPUs. Now, the test system uses a B450 motherboard from MSI and 32 GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 2933 MHz. The GPU used the still the patched together RX 580 that I use ever since I gave away the XFX variant to a buddy of mine. To avoid any GPU bottlenecks, all games will be tested at the lowest resolution and settings that I can specify in-game. And yes, I did use the Gigasus rendering test to have an estimate of IPC for this chip, but since it shares the same architecture as the Ryzen 5 2600, the results for the 1500X should not come as a surprise if you've seen that video. But that comes after the gaming results, and Marvel Rivals is the game to start off this section. I went for 720 resolution and 30% render scale, and every slider set to the lowest possible value. In return, the 1500X averages 133 FPS and almost reaches 80 FPS for the 1% lows. And since I asked for 60 FPS for the 1% lows, the results clear it for this game. Cyberpunk 2077, however, is a single-player title, so my demands are much lower, at just 30 FPS for the 1% lows. The test used was the included benchmark, ran at 1024 by 768 resolution, low settings and performance FSR. The average FPS reached 100 and the 1% lows managed 70 FPS. Of course I tested Dark Raiders on the CPU. The results, captured at 720 resolution, low settings and 50% render scale, are somewhat in line with what was captured when testing APUs in this game. 59 FPS for the average and 29 FPS for the 1% lows. Now, while I do demand 60 FPS for the 1% lows when it comes to online titles, this game is slower paced. The 1500X can run it, but just barely. When testing Fortnite, I went for 720 resolution and the performance rendering mode. This made sure that the Ryzen 5 1500X is the only responsible component for the 123 FPS on average. The 1% lows of 68 FPS is perfectly fine, at least for my level of competency with this title. Swinging back to single-player titles, we have Control. Granted, this is an older AAA title, but this is probably the best Metroidvania game out there, and it showed up as a free deal on Epic Games for a few times now. Using DirectX 11 lower settings at 960 by 540 resolution, the processor managed 152 FPS on average and 61 FPS for the 1% lows. To me it looks like in a real-world setup, you'll probably need to worry more about the GPU. The performance in Rainbow Six Siege is strongly CPU dependent. To make sure that this stays true, I tested the game at 124 by 768 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings. This enabled the CPU to average above 200 FPS and get 158 FPS for the 1% lows. Doom Eternal is a single-player title that is pretty light on CPU demands. I went for 800 by 600 and low settings when testing this game. During the first battle, the average FPS reached 193. In terms of 1% lows, the Ryzen 5 1500X got to 141. This is perfectly fine for this title, so it will be up to the GPU and the video quality settings to deliver a good game experience. Apex Legends is an easy to run title, at least when considering CPUs. To make sure the test run stayed CPU bound, I opted for 720 resolution and lowest possible settings. The CPU didn't reach the 300 FPS cap, so the average framerate of 194 FPS is not affected by it. The 1% lows are fine in absolute value, at 124 FPS. Now, I would not mind playing the game like this, but the 1% lows represent a drop to around 60% of the average FPS, and more competitive players will spot it. Far Cry 6 enjoys my much lower standards for single-player titles, where it just needs to cross 30 FPS with the 1% lows. And the Ryzen 5 1500X does deliver more than twice as much, with 64 FPS for that percentile metric. The average FPS hits mid-80s, and if you compare the two numbers, you can tell that the frame delivery is pretty good. My fear that the results for Overwatch 2 will be affected by the 600 FPS frame cap proved to be unfounded. At 720 resolution, 50% render scale and low settings, the Ryzen 5 1500X peaked at 588 FPS. The average FPS was 474, and the 1% lows reached 254 FPS. As mentioned with Apex Legends, these numbers are very good in absolute value, but more competitive players should aim for 1% lows at 70 to 80% of the average. I tested Resident Evil 4 just to make sure that the CPU won't be a problem if you decide to play this game. The test was done at 800 by 600, low settings and performance FSR. The 1500X got an average FPS above 100 and more importantly, the 1% lows at 69 FPS. This is good enough for a title where I need only 30 FPS for the 1% lows. But Counter-Strike 2, however, has a higher standard to meet, of at least 60 FPS for the 1% lows. Thankfully though, the Ryzen chip managed 74 FPS for that performance metric. As for the average, the 1500X managed 125 FPS at 720 resolution, low settings and balanced FSR. Back to single-player titles, Borderlands 3 was tested at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and very low settings. This would get the GPU out of the equation, leaving it up to the CPU to average 83 FPS and manage 58 FPS for the 1% lows. This is well above what I want for single-player titles, so the 1500X passes this test. DOTA 2 is notoriously CPU bound at low settings, even at 1080 resolution. And if you remember the performance of Intel Xeon E3-1241V3, then the 81 FPS on average and 46 FPS for the 1% lows won't come as a surprise. This puts the 1500X on the same level as the aforementioned Xeon, at least for this particular game. Robocop City of Heroes brings us back to the single-player requirements of 30 FPS for the 1% lows. Now, the game is quite GPU demanding, so I resorted to lower settings, 720 resolution and 33% render scale. And while not completely CPU bound, the game got the 1% lows at 53 FPS and the average at 61. Good enough for this title. The 1500X ended up blowing away my expectations in the finals. I thought I'd get a performance similar to the Haswell Xeon I mentioned earlier in this video, but at 720 resolution, 50% render scale and lower settings, the Ryzen chip averaged 121 FPS and got the 1% lows in the low 70s. This may be due to the DDR4 higher speeds, or maybe Embark Studios managed to do some optimizing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is one of the remaining single-player titles to test. I ran the benchmark at 800 by 600, lowest quality settings, and I got 113 FPS on average and 57 FPS for the 1% lows. The game is quite slow-paced, so the CPU won't hold you back. Terminator puts an end to the gaming benchmark section, and just like the previous game, it enjoys a more relaxed 30 plus FPS for the 1% lows requirement. I ran my test at 1280 by 1024, lower settings and 50% render scale. Both the average FPS of over 200 and the 1% lows in the mid-90s are overkill for this title. To gauge IPC improvements, I resort to rendering a video review of an R9 270. And since the card starring in that video pairs an Asus cooler with a Gigabyte PCB, it, and the test as well, got nicknamed Gigasus. By multiplying the amount of time needed to finish the render to both the number of cores and the average frequency, we get the number of clock cycles needed to complete this well-determined workload. The lower the number, the higher the IPC, and in the case of the 1500X, the 1208 seconds translates to 17,395 billion clock cycles. And this places it basically right next to the Ryzen 5 2600. This was to be expected since both have basically the same architecture, SMT and L3 cache size. I am quite happy to see the quad-core still being quite usable, and coupled with the AM4 platform, it could be the basis of a nice entry-level gaming PC, if the price of the CPU is decent. At 20 USD, the 1500X has no competition. It performs better than pretty much all i7s available at this price level. With a decent AM4 motherboard, one could then upgrade later on, all the way to a 5000 series CPU. And this is probably the only way I would buy the 1500X. Build a PC around it, play games while saving some money, then sell it. And using the little money saved, get a Ryzen 5 3600. There is, however, a question that keeps nagging me. How much of the 1500X's relevance comes from the Ryzen architecture and how much of it comes from being able to use DDR4? Fortunately, I will be able to get an answer to that question, thanks to two CPUs from Intel, both of them using DDR4. But that's for another video. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it.